Hey everyone, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about my research project, which was on COVID-19 in professional sports. It was a multinational comparative analysis regarding the question, are government sports-related COVID-19 policies consistent with their national COVID-19 policies? So why research this question? I've always had a personal interest in sports, and I've always really been interested in where sports and politics go together and intersect. COVID-19 has caused tons of policy implementations across the board in most countries, and sports are obviously involved in that. So with it being a global pandemic, I wanted to see what different countries are doing and how they're doing it. So the first step was to create a literature review, and I just wanted to see what else had been said and published in regards to COVID-19 and sports policy. So I came up with four general categories of literature. The first being early stage articles that regarded COVID-19 in sports. So these were articles published very early on in the pandemic that talked about COVID-19 in sports, just generally. The second set of articles was articles that regarded athlete protection and well-being in the context of COVID-19. So these articles sort of focused on athletes rather than the general public, which is what we mostly focus on when we talk about public health, but obviously athletes need to be regarded too. The third category was COVID-19 policies, financial impact on professional sports. This was probably the most well-documented and researched topic, as you can imagine. And the fourth category was national policies regarding COVID-19 in professional sports. So this sounds like it might be close to my research question, but it wasn't because none of these articles actually had multinational comparisons. It was all just like one country being focused on in each article. So theory to explain what I expect to happen, which is inconsistencies between national COVID-19 and stadium attendance policy, national COVID-19 policy, sorry, and stadium attendance policy. So the reason I expect these discrepancies is, or these inconsistencies, is because the great amount of testing discrepancies that we saw early on in the United States, where you saw like professional athletes getting tested on a regular basis, sometimes weekly or even daily, and celebrities as well. So you see this sort of trend that governments are allowing these sports teams to get these tests when many public health workers needed it, and people like you or me might have needed them too if we felt sick. Um, Also, many sports teams are actually very financially unstable, and that's in spite of the fact that they're very valuable assets for countries and states to have. And that's because they have significant societal impacts. For example, these three teams that I have down here on the left, you have Barcelona Stadium, which is actually the top visited tourist attraction in Barcelona in the city, and Real Madrid right here, also a name that you guys all know. These are two teams that are struggling financially heavily, and they already were struggling pre-pandemic and had received illegal government loans and got in trouble for it. And since the pandemic, they've asked for more government loans to help pay their players in the nature of like 200 million euros or so. So a lot of money that other businesses could only dream of obtaining from the government. And on the right here, you have Schalke 04, which is a German team that was founded in 1904, hence the 04. And this is an extreme, it's like a cult team in Germany. I mean, they have 550,000 members and extremely important for German society and culture. But they're struggling, and they've been struggling financially for a long time, and they're on the verge of making a deal with the German government, or their state government actually, to receive a 20 million euro loan. So quite a significant loan that most, again, teams could only dream of, or not teams, businesses. So basically, I was thinking that in order to keep these teams and sports organizations afloat, that governments would allow fans in stadiums to help, you know, uh, prevent financial damage because ticket revenue is important. And like I said, a lot of these sports teams already had very delicate balances in their finances, so they need every dollar they can get. Um, so how was I going to approach this? What I did was I created an Excel file that included 22 countries and 13 observations for each country, and I ran it in RStudio. The observations, some key ones included stadium attendances during the pandemic and per capita attendance during the pandemic. And I would kind of compare that to the strictness index that was created by Oxford. It's not an index that I created, from 0 to 100 of each country. And 0 is the least strict and 100 is most strict. So I created an average of that and assigned it to each country. And then after I ran the analytics on it, I wanted to select cases to perform qualitative analysis on those. So here are some of the graphs that I came up with. On the left here, you have the average attendance in 2020, so during the pandemic, of each country versus their average strictness index. So you don't really see a whole lot other than the fact that Russia, this is Russia, has had a lot of fans, like 7,400 or so on average, which is quite a bit more than the second. And you have Belarus down here, complete outlier, who is barely implementing any COVID-19 policy with very low strictness rating. Next, moving on to this chart right here, which is a box plot, you see the average strictness index versus countries that allowed fans in stadiums versus countries that did not allow fans in stadiums. And as you'd expect, countries that did not allow fans in stadiums actually were stricter on average, even though the strictest country actually did allow fans in stadiums, and that's China. Down here, this outlier is Belarus again. You're going to see that a couple times. So moving on to this one, this is the standard deviation of the strictness index. So how much did their strictness change throughout the pandemic? And interestingly, countries that did not allow fans in stadiums deviated more. They tended to change their policy more frequently than countries that did allow fans in their stadiums. So maybe more stable countries were allowing fans in their stadiums because they were stable. And it's maybe an indicator. But all the way on the right here, this is a very interesting one because you actually have a very nice line here, and it measures the average attendance during the pandemic per capita of each country versus the average strictness index over here. So as you see, again, this very nice line that goes through it, but you have two cases that don't fit in. That's Japan, and that's, of course, Belarus. It's very interesting that Japan doesn't fit in. They weren't very strict and they allowed a lot of fans in, which makes sense, but they were an anomaly in the sense that they didn't match this line. So I do want to perform further analysis. So these are my selected cases: China, Russia, Belarus, Japan, and the United States, who I wanted to include because we're in America and because I couldn't include them in my qualitative analysis because I couldn't find stadium attendance data for the United States. So why is the strictest country, China, allowing fans in their stadiums? Well, it's because they allocated 23,000 tests to staff and players. And it's also because they've been able to regionally contain the virus in some areas, and they created a bubble system where all the games would be played in one region of China, and fans could attend games there. And I think what I read in several articles, a big motivation was for China to do this was they wanted to restore normality quickly in society. They wanted to show that they had things under control and that fans could go back into stadiums and things were getting better. So that was a big motivation for China. Russia had different motivations, but in a sense similar ones too. They again had tremendous amount of fans on average. Up here you had 7,400 fans on average, but not shown here is that their top average, so the team that had the most attendance on average, had 23,000 fans in their stadium, which is a lot, about 14,000 more than the second most. So it's quite a significant amount. The reason that this might have happened is because Russia's concerns about their global standing. As we know, they've released this vaccine called the Sputnik. They released it a long time ago, and it's questionable because recently they actually told their Russian citizens who took this vaccine to avoid drinking alcohol for 2 months after taking it. We also know that Russia has pretty questionable case and death statistics, and that's likely because Russia wants to appear that the situation is under control, that things are getting better. In fact, Vladimir Putin actually said that they had reached their peak a while ago and that things were better, and that was part of the reason why he suggested that it was okay to have all these fans in the stadiums. So it could be part of their whole stance that we're doing okay. Similarly, you have Belarus, who was an anomaly in so many ways, and you wonder why. And it's because they have President Lukashenko, who is also known as the last European dictator. He allowed for the continuation of professional sports play without pause, unlike every other European country. And they were the least strict in my data set and the fourth most consistent. So they were very consistently not strict on COVID. And the reasoning for this is probably because there's a big political battle between Belarus as a country and its European peers. They tend to side with Russia and lean towards Russia more often than not. And they also want to have this appearance that things are under control. Again, it's almost a dictatorship in a sense. So they want to appear that things are okay, hence allowing fans in stadiums. And they also had some early financial benefits. Again, they're the only team that did allow games to continue, especially and with fans in stadiums. So they're the only pro soccer league on TV. So they made a lot of money with TV deals across the world. So that's perhaps another motivation. The United States wasn't included in my quantitative analysis, but I do want to analyze them here. They would have been above average in terms of strictness. This is likely because cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., they're all very strict on COVID, but again, highly inconsistent, as we all know, in terms of COVID policy across the country. And it remains the same way with stadium attendance policy. This graphic that I created on the left here, this map, actually analyzed all the stadium attendance policies in the NFL, and countries that are highlighted in blue are not countries, sorry, states that are highlighted in blue are states that did not allow fans in stadiums in their NFL games, or allowed very few fans in their NFL games, and states that are highlighted in red allowed more than 10,000 fans, often 20,000 fans and more in their stadiums for NFL games. And I thought this was really fascinating because you look over at the presidential election map and they're very similar. They're almost the same. Obviously, not every state has an NFL team, so that's why you have some white. But with the exception of North Carolina, every single country matches in terms of color. So you see a lot of perhaps political motivation for allowing fans in stadiums. Now, Japan wasn't necessarily inconsistent in terms of COVID-19 policy. Like I said, they allowed a lot of fair amount of fans in stadiums, and they were not that strict, so that makes sense. But they didn't fit this line here, so I wanted to analyze them a little bit more. And I also wanted to analyze a case in which we kind of see Japan as a country that has handled the pandemic very well. They have very low cases per 100,000, and they're not very strict. They were the least strict in my data set after Belarus. And they have been able to allow all these fans in stadiums because they actually have been strict in terms of sports. Perhaps they weren't strict in terms of their national policy, but they were stricter in sports policy because they had careful monitoring of fan and player behavior. Um, Players were encouraged to drink out of their own water bottles and not share water bottles during games. They restructured the league schedules so they would limit travel, and temperature checks were required for fans upon entry at stadiums. So you have a fair amount of policies put in place to keep stadiums a safe environment. So even though they weren't strict nationally, they might have been actually quite strict in terms of their stadium attendance policy. Um, Now, a lot of Japanese people actually don't believe that the government is the reason that they're doing so with COVID. They think they got lucky, perhaps that the strain that arrived in Japan or in Asia in general isn't as harsh as the strain of the virus that hit Western Europe and the United States. So that's one theory. They also believe that handshaking in the Western cultures is very common, whereas bowing is more common in Japan. Might be part of the reason that we see these very, very low numbers in cases. Um, so yeah, that was my research. Now the conclusions that I can withdraw from it shows that um, my theory is not fully understanding of the complex relationship between governments and their sports related policy. I assumed that, because money runs the world, that financial reasons would be the prime reason for governments to help protect their sports teams. But it turns out that it was a lot more political, perhaps, and less societal and financial in terms of reasoning. So you see countries like Russia and the United States and Belarus that all had extremely political reasons for implementing sports-related COVID-19 policy. And yeah, so that's what I came up with, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope you guys have a great winter break. I'm going to try my very best to. And stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you so much for your time.